You think, if someone feels this intense, it must mean something. That kind of connection doesn't come from nowhere. The way they look at you, the way they're fully there in certain moments, the way it feels like everything else disappears. When you're with them, it's not casual, it's not surface level. It feels real, almost too real to question, and that's exactly what makes it confusing. Because right after that, they pull back. Not gradually, not in a way that makes sense. Just gone. Colder, distant, harder to reach. And now you're left trying to understand how both of those things can exist in the same person. How someone can feel that present, that intense, and then suddenly feel unavailable. Like you imagined it, but you didn't. What you felt was real, just not in the way you think. Because to understand avoidance, you have to start with something most people get wrong. Emotional suppression doesn't remove feeling. It doesn't make someone feel less. It does the opposite. It compresses it. It contains it. It stores it. And anything that gets stored under pressure doesn't disappear. It builds. Quietly. Over time. Layer by layer. Moment by moment. Every feeling that wasn't expressed. Every reaction that was held back. Every need that was minimized. It all stays. Not visible, but present. And eventually, it needs somewhere to go. That's the part most people never see. Because from the outside, avoidance looks stable, composed, in control. They don't overreact. They don't overwhelm. They don't spill emotion into every moment. So it's easy to assume there's just less going on inside. But it's not less. It's contained, highly controlled, managed, not because they don't feel deeply, because they learned very early that feeling openly doesn't go well. It creates something: discomfort, distance, disconnection. So instead of expressing, they regulate. Instead of showing, they manage. Instead of releasing, they store. And over time, that becomes identity. I'm fine. I don't need much. I handle things. And on the surface, that works. It creates stability. It avoids conflict. It keeps everything under control. But underneath that control, something else is happening: accumulation. Because emotions that aren't processed don't dissolve. They stack. They build pressure. And pressure always looks for release. Not randomly, strategically, in whatever space feels safe enough to allow it. And this is where most people miss what's really happening. Because for many avoidants, there is a space where all of that comes out, not in conversations, not in emotional openness, somewhere else, a place where they can feel without losing control. And for a lot of them, that place is physical intimacy. Not because it's just physical, because it's structured, contained, predictable. There's a beginning, a middle, an end, clear boundaries, unspoken rules. You step into it, you experience it, you step out. No lingering exposure, no ongoing vulnerability that needs to be maintained. And that changes everything, because now they can access intensity without the same level of risk. They can feel something fully without having to explain it, without having to stay in it afterward, without it turning into something that requires emotional continuity. So when they enter that space, all that stored energy finally has somewhere to go. Desire, longing, tension, even tenderness they don't show in daily life. It comes through, strong, focused, undiluted. And to you, it feels undeniable. Because it's not just attraction, it's concentrated emotion. Everything that's been held in, finding a release point. So, of course, it feels different, more intense, more present, more consuming. Because it is. But here's where the misunderstanding begins. That intensity is real, but it's not the same as availability. It's not a signal that they're now open. that they're ready to carry that same depth outside of that moment. It's simply the one place their guard temporarily lowers, not because the fear disappears, because the environment feels controlled enough to allow it. And that distinction changes everything. Because from your side, it feels like truth, like you've seen who they really are. Like this is what's underneath the distance. And if it exists there, it must exist everywhere, right? But for them, it doesn't work like that. Because outside of that space, the same system comes back online. Control returns, distance returns, restraint returns, not intentionally, automatically. And now, you're left holding both versions, the intensity and the withdrawal, trying to make sense of how they fit together, trying to figure out which one is real. But the truth is, they both are. One is just contained, and the other is what happens when that container is gone. And this is where the illusion quietly forms. Not because anyone is trying to create it, because the experience feels too real to question. You don't just feel attraction, you feel connection, presence, focus, like they're with you in a way that most people never are. No distraction, no distance, no hesitation, just there. And in those moments, it doesn't feel fragmented. It feels complete, like you've finally accessed something deeper, something consistent, something that explains everything else. The distance, the restraint, the silence. You start thinking, this is who they really are. This is what's underneath. This is what we could be all the time. And that thought is where things start to shift. Because now you're not just experiencing the moment, you're assigning meaning to it. You're connecting it to the future, to potential, to possibility. And that's a very human response, because most people are wired to do that. When something feels intense, we assume it's significant. When something feels deep, we assume it's building into something. When someone shows up fully in a moment, we assume they can show up that way consistently. But here's the part that doesn't get seen. Presence is not the same as openness. They look similar. They feel similar. But they function completely differently. Because presence can exist without exposure. It can exist without continuity. It can exist inside a moment without extending beyond it. And that's exactly what's happening here. They are present, fully engaged, but not fully revealed. Not in a way that carries forward. Not in a way that stays open once the moment ends. It's contained, like a compartment, where intensity is allowed, but only there. Only under those conditions. And once that space closes, so does the access. Not because it didn't matter, because it wasn't built to extend. And this is where confusion starts to take hold. Because from your side, it doesn't feel contained. It feels expansive, like something opened, like something shifted. So when it ends, you don't just go back to neutral. You look for continuity. You look for signs that what you felt is still there, in their tone, their attention, their presence. But instead, you get distance, less engagement, less clarity, less of what you just experienced. And now, your mind tries to reconcile that. Did I misread it? Was that real? Why does it feel so different now? And instead of questioning the structure, you question yourself, because the moment felt too strong to dismiss. So it must mean something, right? But this is where the misinterpretation locks in. You start translating intensity as emotional depth, passion as emotional readiness, presence as emotional availability. And they're not the same thing. Because what you experienced was not a window into consistency. It was a release point, a moment where everything they usually contain was allowed to surface, under conditions that felt safe enough to hold it. And that's why it felt different. Because it was different, not more real, more concentrated, more focused, more contained. And that concentration can feel like depth, even when it's not sustainable. And now, something subtle starts happening. You begin trying to recreate it, not consciously, but you feel the shift, the contrast between what was and what is now. And you want to close that gap. So you lean in, ask more, engage more. Try to bring that same connection into everyday interaction, into conversation, into consistency. Because in your mind, if it existed once, it should exist again. But from their side, that shift feels different. Because now the connection is moving out of a controlled space into something open-ended, less predictable, less contained. And that's where the pressure begins. Not because you're doing something wrong, because the environment changed. And with that change, their system responds the same way it always has. It tightens, pulls back, reduces exposure, creates space, not to disconnect, to regulate. And now you're both responding to the same moment in completely different ways. You're moving closer to maintain connection. They're creating distance to maintain stability. And neither one feels understood, because both are reacting to what feels real on their side. But underneath it, the structure hasn't changed. The connection still exists in compartments, not as a continuous line. So every time you try to stretch a moment into something ongoing, it starts to break. Not because it wasn't real, because it wasn't designed to carry forward. And that's the part that's hard to accept, because it means what you felt was true, but not predictive. It doesn't tell you what comes next. It doesn't guarantee what builds. It doesn't define what the relationship becomes. It only reflects what was possible in that specific moment, under those specific conditions. And once you see that, something starts to shift. You stop chasing consistency from isolated experiences. You stop trying to turn intensity into direction. And you start asking a different question. Not, how strong did this feel? But, does this exist outside of the moment? And once you start asking that question, you begin to notice something that was always there. Not random, not unpredictable. A pattern, a rhythm. The connection doesn't move forward in a straight line. It moves in waves, in and out, closer, then distant, engaged, then unavailable. And if you're not watching closely, it just feels confusing, like things change without warning, like something shifts for no clear reason. But underneath that, there's a very consistent mechanism at play. Distance creates desire. Closeness creates pressure. And that combination drives everything. Because when there's space, when there's no expectation, no emotional demand, no sense of needing to maintain anything, something opens. Their system relaxes. There's room again. Room to feel curiosity, attraction, interest, even longing. Not forced, not triggered. It just returns, naturally. And from that place, they move closer. They initiate. They engage. Sometimes suddenly, sometimes intensely. And in those moments, it can feel like everything is aligning. Like the distance meant nothing. Like the connection is finally stabilizing. But what you're actually experiencing is the release of tension. All the pressure that built during closeness has been reduced. So now the system can open again. And when it opens, it doesn't do it halfway. It comes through with intensity, focus, presence, and often that energy channels into physical connection. Because it's the fastest way to collapse distance, the quickest way to feel close again, without having to process what created the gap. So the reconnection feels powerful, even stronger than before, because now it's layered with relief. You're back. They're here. The connection is alive again. And in that moment, it's easy to believe this is progress, that things are deepening, that you're moving forward. But this is where the cycle resets. Because as closeness increases, so does internal tension. Not visibly, internally. Something starts scanning for expectation, for emotional demand, for anything that feels like it might require sustained openness. And the closer things get, the louder that signal becomes. Not because the connection is wrong, because it's getting harder to regulate. So before that pressure builds too far, the system does what it knows. It creates space. Again, sometimes subtle, less engagement, shorter responses, a shift in tone. Other times, more abrupt, pulling back, disappearing, disconnecting. But the effect is always the same. Distance is restored. And with that distance, regulation returns. Calm, control, stability. But now something else is happening. On both sides. For them, space restores safety. And once that safety returns, so does desire. Slowly, quietly, until the cycle begins again. But for you, that same distance does something different. It amplifies everything that just happened. The intensity, the closeness, the moments that felt real. Because now they're gone. And absence has a way of increasing value. You replay it. You analyze it. You try to understand what changed, what caused it, what it meant. And without realizing it, the connection starts taking up more space in your mind. Not because it's growing, because it's inconsistent. And inconsistency creates focus. It pulls attention. It keeps you engaged, trying to solve it, trying to stabilize it, trying to get back to that moment. And this is where it becomes addictive, not in a dramatic way, in a subtle, psychological way. Because now you're not just responding to the person, you're responding to the pattern, the contrast between presence and absence, closeness and distance, intensity and withdrawal. Those shifts create emotional spikes, highs, lows, relief, uncertainty, and over time, your system starts associating that intensity with connection, with meaning, with something real. But here's the part that changes everything once you see it. That intensity isn't coming from stability. It's coming from contrast, from the gap between what's there and what's missing. Because when something is consistent, it doesn't spike the same way. It settles, it deepens, it becomes steady. But this moves up, down, back, forward. And the movement itself creates the feeling, not just the person, not just the connection, the pattern. And once you recognize that, you stop labeling it the same way. You stop calling it chemistry without questioning it. You stop calling it depth without looking at what actually lasts. Because real connection doesn't depend on distance to feel strong. It doesn't need absence to create desire. It doesn't rely on withdrawal to reset itself. It builds, gradually, consistently, without collapsing in between. And that's the difference most people miss. They measure connection by how powerful the peaks feel, instead of how stable the baseline is. But peaks don't tell you what something is. They only tell you what it can feel like in a moment. And if those moments only exist after distance, after withdrawal, after something breaks, then what you're experiencing isn't continuity. It's a cycle. And cycles can feel intense, even meaningful, but they don't automatically build something that lasts. They repeat until something interrupts them, or someone steps out of them. And once you see the cycle clearly, it stops feeling mysterious. It stops feeling like something you just need to figure out, or fix, or finally get right. Because the pattern isn't hidden anymore. It's visible. Distance creates desire. Closeness creates pressure. Pressure creates withdrawal. Withdrawal resets the cycle over and over again. And the hardest part is not understanding it. It's accepting what it actually means. Because once you see it, you're faced with a different question. Not, how do I get back to those moments? But, what do those moments actually lead to? Because intensity on its own can be convincing. It can feel rare, powerful, even meaningful. But intensity doesn't tell you where something is going. Consistency does. And that's where everything becomes clear. Not in the peak. In what happens after the peak ends. Do they stay? Do they remain open? Do they build on what was felt? Or does everything reset until the next moment pulls you back in again? Because if connection only exists inside intensity, then outside of it, there's nothing holding it in place. No structure, no continuity, no foundation, just moments that feel like more than they can actually sustain. And this is where most people lose themselves, not in the intensity, in what they believe the intensity means. They start adjusting, explaining, waiting, hoping the next moment will finally match what they felt before. But every time they return to that peak, they also return to the drop that follows. And over time, that does something quiet but significant. It shifts your focus away from yourself and into the pattern. You start tracking it, anticipating it, trying to stay aligned with something that keeps moving. And without noticing, you begin tolerating what you would never accept in a stable connection. Not because you're weak, because the experience feels strong. But strength of feeling is not the same as strength of structure. And if there's no structure, no continuity, no consistency that carries forward, then what you're holding on to isn't a relationship. It's a repeating experience. And that's the difference. Most people don't catch until much later, when the pattern has already shaped how they think, how they feel, how they show up. So the real shift isn't about understanding avoidance. It's about understanding what you're participating in, what you're staying inside of, what you're calling connection. That might actually be something else. And once you see that, you stop asking the same questions. You stop trying to decode every shift. You stop chasing every return. And you start looking at one thing only. What stays? What remains when the intensity is gone? What's actually there on an ordinary day? Without the highs, without the pull, without the illusion of something building. Because that is where the truth sits. Not in how high it takes you, in how steady it holds you. And if you really recognize this pattern, not just intellectually, but in your own experience, comment, I saw the pattern too late. Because most people don't notice it at the beginning. They notice it after they've already been pulled into it, after the moments have already convinced them, after the cycle has already repeated enough times to feel familiar. And if you're starting to see it now, then you're already at the point where things can change, not by forcing the connection, but by finally seeing what it actually is. And if you want more content that breaks patterns like this, not on the surface, but at the level they actually operate, stay with the inner Odyssey, where we don't just talk about connection, we expose what's really driving it.